first one on the history of Brook, given by somebody many of you know very well, because Graham was a resident of Brook for 40 years. And in his spare time, he wrote this book, which when Mike kindly introduced me to Brook Village, he gave me. And my wife and I read it within the first couple of days, and we've never looked back, never looked anywhere else either. It contains all sorts of wonderful things, many of which Graham is going to impart to you tonight, and some things which aren't in the book from more recent research will also pop up from time to time. So you're going to find it a fascinating excursion. Graham, I believe, is open to questions afterwards.
Yeah.
Yes. We will have, hopefully, an extraordinarily interesting meeting. But it also befalls me on behalf of the museum to give Graham a very special thank you, because he's recently retired from the Board of Trustees, but he hasn't been officially thanked, at least not effusively enough as far as I'm concerned. The incredible work that he's done for the museum. If you go to the museum, and many of you won't have been there for some time, you'll now see a whole range of colourful posters which tell you what the exhibits are all about. This is quite new for us. In the old days, you used to have to stand in front of it and guess. And nowadays, you can actually read what Graham has written, and it tells you something about each of the exhibits. And it has made a huge difference to the way people come in and see the museum. So without wasting any more time, let me hand you over to my dear friend, Graham Bradley.
Thanks very much, Tim. Very kind of you. And thank you, Philippa, for organising these events. And I hope most of you will come to a lot of these events that the museum is organising over this year. Those of you who've heard me talk about this before, I hope you've, like me, have forgotten most of it. But for those of you who haven't heard me talk about it before, anyhow, it'll be new, so I hope you enjoy it. So we might as well just get on with it. First of all, Brook, at least you know where it is. You're here. We're going, as it were, from the Neolithic period, or possibly the Bronze Age period, to be honest, to modern times. So what's the connection, really, between Stonehenge and Brook? Well, it's in the bones and the teeth, actually, that you find at Stonehenge. There's an awful lot of Welsh bones there for a start, which if you've just hauled a credible amount of blue stones across from Wales, it's perhaps not surprising you landed at Stonehenge and died. But apart from that, there's several other bones, one of which I'm particularly interested in is the Amesborough Bronze Age archer, who was dug up near Stonehenge. He was dated to 2200 BC, 2300 BC, I think it was. Which is interesting in its own right, of course. But apart from that, examination of his teeth, his enamel in particular, showed that he actually was brought up in the Alps. It's amazing what you can tell these days, isn't it? So how was it that this young man, archer from the Alps, ended up at Stonehenge? It's a long way away, isn't it? And what is the connection with Brook? Well, the connection is very real, because there's an old ancient trackway that goes all the way from Stonehenge, which is off the scale. Oh dear, wrong one. That's all right. Over here somewhere. And it comes all the way down to the coast at Folkestone. And believe it or not, it actually continues across here as Lalaulan. It goes in for about 50 kilometres into France. And the interesting thing, of course, is this archer must have used this track, and he must have passed through Wye and Brook, or near enough Wye and Brook, except, of course, there was no Wye and Brook there for some centuries after that. So how is it that he managed to cross, first of all, this bit of water here, which is 2,200 or so BC? Well, there's only one way he could have done it. He couldn't have swum it, could it? We all knew that Captain Webb's the first man anyhow to swim across the channel, so he couldn't have done it. So he must have crossed here on a boat. Obviously, somehow. There's only no other explanation for it. And we do, of course, know that there were boats available in the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age boat at Dover can be seen, of course, in the museum there. That was dated to 1500 BC. But there are other boats which are even older than that have been unearthed in the Humber, 2 or 3 boats which are dated to about 2000 BC. So it's no stretch of the imagination to think that there would have been boats around at his sort of time, 2300 BC. So that's how he must have crossed. But this pathway, as likely as not, would have been there for some time before that. Basically, it follows the North Downs all the way across from Stonehenge. And moving by the escarpments at that time was a logical way of doing things. Walking across country was full of difficulties of navigation as well as whoever you might meet on the way. So walking at the top of an escarpment was a good thing to do. So that's the reason, I think, why the ancient trackway formed where it is. It runs down right across the whole length of the North Downs. And that, of course, as you know, is just up there by the kneading trough. In fact, there are always 2 tracks, not 1 track, well, for the most part anyhow, there are 2 tracks. And they have been very well delineated exactly as to where they were. As far as Wye is concerned, that there were 2 tracks before you got down to Wye, if you're coming from Stonehenge, and then they join into one to cross the river, about where the bridge is at the moment. It then proceeds as 1 track up Bridge Street, where Bridge Street is, and then when you meet Church Street, if you know your Wye, you either turn left, as it were, and go across. There wouldn't be any houses, of course, at that time, but go diagonally across to the Wye Crown, and behind it, then you're taking the high road. If you continue up Bridge Street, and if you go along Cherry Garden Lane and across the fields, you eventually end up at Pickersdale. So there you are. Our Bronze Age man must, I think, have walked through the area that was to become Pickersdale and Brook. Moving on a bit, we can move now a couple of thousand years or so forward. We move to the Roman period. What did the Romans do for us? Well, first of all, of course, in the Roman period, Wye itself was a very important ville. It has its villas, it has its forges as well. It was an important centre. So it's only to be expected, really, that some Romans might have wandered across to Brook, if only for a Sunday afternoon outing. But is there any evidence that they settled at all in our vicinity? Well, this shows you a map. It's obviously it's a Google. Oh dear, it's a Google Earth map, which I've superimposed the roads to so you can see it more clearly. This is Brook down here. This is the road coming up to Pickersdale. Then you turn left to Wye or right towards Brabourne. Now, there's 2 interesting people who wrote about the early 20th century, one of which was Igglesden and one of which was Jack Richardson. Now, Igglesden was the editor, and I think he may have been the owner too, of the Kentish Express. And he wrote a series of articles called Saunters Through Kent with Pen and Pencil. And one of these saunters was through Brook. The delightful things to read, full of blossoms and sort of smoke lazily coming from chimneys, and well worth reading. Jack Richardson actually was someone who lived in Brook and was brought up in the early 20th century in Brook. He also wrote along similar veils, and it's very beautiful stuff to read and very interesting. He went a bit more and told us quite a lot about the people who lived in Brook at that sort of time. But the point about Igglesden is he went on a lot about a field here which he was absolutely sure showed evidence of Romans being there. The evidence being that he found a lot of Roman coins, or so he says. He found a lot of oyster shells, and he also found a lot of ancient pottery. He said ancient pottery, he didn't say Roman pottery. Now, the other thing about Igglesden is that he's a superb writer of pleasure of the environment, but he he was not a terribly good historian, so I'm not sure how much you can necessarily believe him, because he also said there'd be a Roman garrison up here with all these Romans walking on those little terraces you see around the kneading trough, waiting for the enemy to come. Well, of course, this faces south, and the enemy would therefore be coming from Roman Gaul. The real enemy was coming on the north coast, of course, and I think the Romans would have been aware of that. So he can go over the top a little bit, but it is an unusual field there. It's got very steep embankments here and here, as if they'd been cut out of a hillock, and it seems as though the top has been flattened as well. It does look an unusual area, and it certainly warrants, I think, further investigations by people who are really expert. You notice that Roman field is also next to a little pathway here. If you go up the road, turn right, or going up the hill, and turn right straight away, you come across a trackway. And there's reason to believe that that might have been the old road into Brook. On the opposite side, a little bit higher, you've got a thing called Chalky Walk. Now, locals will know what Chalky Walk is. A very chalky walk. Explains what it is. It's a steep embankments both sides, coming down to a very chalky path that goes up into the hill. Old maps really show it's really continuous with this road down here as well. And it would be reasonable to suppose that it may have been a path into Brook from on top of the hills in times gone by before this was developed. No positive proof, but I'm inclined to believe that it could have been the old road into Brook. It's called, locally, it was called the Carpets. I don't know if you still call it the Carpets. Other interesting things from this map show you the Cuckelscombe area here. Cuckelscombe or Cocklescombe or Cuckles Corner, depends what you're reading as to exactly what you call it. There's only about 3 or 4 houses here. There's fish ponds here on the left, if that sort of orientates you. There's reason to believe that the main centre in this area was at Cuckelscombe and not in Brook or in Hampton, because the old records for Brook, certainly the hearth tax and the land tax records, come under the borough of Cuckelscombe. So it seems as though it might be an old tithing, an old borough, from which Brook obviously developed as the main centre in the course of time. So this was the epicentre of this area, if you like, going back a long way. Since a lot of boroughs, it's not unusual for them to actually be developed at the sites of Roman villas, one might almost speculate, and this really is rather wild speculation, there could even be an old villa underneath Cuckelscombe somewhere, if you can persuade the owners to dig in their gardens deeply. This also shows Hampton Manor here, which plays quite a big part in the history of Brook. There's not much left of it now, but some of you will be aware of what it's like. It's really an old moated manor, built presumably between 1250 and 1350. All that's left now are the moating bits and a bit of groundwork. Very pleasant area to walk, though. Talking of the Romans, the only thing that's worth mentioning is that I once did a field walk with a number of people, organised by Sheila Sweetenberg, who's a trustee of the museum, an expert historian. We went round with an archaeologist and walked across the Burgate Field, which is opposite where the museum is, in a long line, walked across to see if we could find anything. And one thing we did find was a Neolithic skin scraper, or so I was confidently told it's what it was. Interestingly, though, as you walked further into the field, you came across more and more clinker, you know, the sort of things you get from old furnaces, hard sort of metallic stone type thing. And then if you went beyond the middle of the field on the other side, it got less and less. It does seem as though there was an old forge in the middle of that field sometime in the past, of which there's no written record. The expert couldn't say what period it was, but it's not impossible that it could have been Roman at that time. There are a number of other forges around in Wye itself, using probably iron ore from the top of the hill just behind the crown, where all those bumps are, was probably quarries for iron ore. Next we move to the period of the Jutes. The Jutes are supposed to be from Jutland, although I think in fact they'd moved further south before they actually moved across to this country. So from northern Denmark, and there's a lot of stories about Hengist and Horsa. You must have heard about Hengist and Horsa, and here they are, looking not so terrible as they invade our country. In fact, the story is that Hengist and Horsa were invited across to this country by Vortigern, which was a well-known Romano-British chieftain. And they were invited over to give them a hand with the Picts who were causing problems, and apparently they did so with great success. And for this they were rewarded land, apparently in Thanet, where they settled for a while and thought about it and thought, I like this Thanet all that much. I can't really blame them. I thought we deserved more than Thanet. So they called back home, as it were. I was sending messages back home. Why don't you, a few of you folks, come across and we'll see what we can do about this. So a lot of Jutes landed in various parts of Kentish area, and they all collected in a place called Hengist Cell. Now, Hengist Cell, well, Hengist bit is pretty obvious. Hengist, and Cell is a sort of place, so it's Hengist Place. But experts have said that this translates to Hinks Hill, just up the road. So when you're next passing Hinks Hill, if you ever open up the road there, you can think that maybe that is where Hengist collected all his warriors and then marched up to Aylesford and did battle with Vortigern. And no one's ever reported what actually happened with that battle. But everyone seems to agree that Horsa was killed in the fight anyhow. And Hengist ended up with the whole of the southeast of England. So it did seem as though perhaps Hengist did in fact win in the end. Of course, the whole of the southeast then became the country, well, the place, Kent, what is now our Kent. And big thing that the Jutes did for us really was to produce a very good system of administration. They didn't do this because they liked administration all that much, I don't suppose, for a minute. But of course it would be very useful for taxing purposes to know exactly where people lived, etc. So they produced a system of lathes, hundreds and manors within Kent, which is in essence then the kingdom of Kent, if you like. And there are two maps here, so excuse me hitting the wrong things. There are two maps here. They're the same, obviously. This is the Kent coast coming down here, Sheppey here, sort of Margate over there, Dungeness down there, and this is the land margin along here with Sussex. They're both the same in essence. The system of lathes, hundreds and manors listed for centuries, really. It only came off the statute books, I think, in 1920, although it hadn't been used really for a while before then. You can see more clearly in the 13th century situation what the lathes looked like. They were basically some north to south bits of Kent. So they're a bit like the counties would be to England. These lathes were to Kent. Now, within each lathe, the country was split up for administrative purposes. Now, going back to the top one here, at that time, Wye had its own lathe. There was a lathe of Wye. Between 1086 and the 13th century, Wye had lost its title to this lathe. And I think that's probably because William the Conqueror gave Wye to Battle Abbey. He did that for very good reasons, because he thought that with all the death and murders and blood he'd produced there, it might go better with him if he actually gave the Battle Abbey some money. So he actually gave Wye to Battle Abbey, and after that, Wye lost perhaps the significance that it had before, which is probably why it's changed from White lathe to Scray lathe here. Now, within Wye lathe, as it was in 1086, all these mosaics here show the hundreds of Wye lathe. So these are like counties, actually, or district councils, if you like, within the separate lathes, and they were called hundreds, based initially, I think, on 100 households, although no doubt that changed in time. And here we have the hundreds of Wye lathes down here, of which, of course, Wye itself, as a village or town was part of the Wye Lathe. There are also several other hundreds within the Wye Lathe, and you'll perhaps recognise some of the names now. But then within each hundred was split up into manors. So each hundred was split up into manors. So the manors of Wye Hundred became all these here. And now, of course, you see that we're in the picture here in Brook, because here in Brook, we're in the manor of Wye Hundred, and Wye Hundred is in the lathe of Wye as well. Yeah, slightly complicated, but you see the logic of it all, can't you? And there's several other places along here you will recognise as well as different manors in the vicinity. Wye itself, of course, Hampton, just up the way there. Trimworth is, if you don't know, is just on the way to Canterbury. If you go past Olante, on the left-hand side, about a mile beyond it, is Trimworth. That's Trimworth Manor. And on the right side, opposite it, on the same road, you get to Fanscombe, which is that big, deep combe that used to be used as a racecourse initially by Wye. There are also other names you'll recognise, like Eastwell, Bolton, Allop, etc. So this is the structure that the Jutes gave us that lasted for centuries, a system of organisation that was terribly successful and kept going through all the periods that were to follow. Now, after the Jutes were actually defeated by the Mercians in about 800. The Mercians didn't last very long down here because King Ecgbert of Wessex unified Wessex and Kent together in 825 AD, and he gained the title of King of Kent. I'm not quite sure where this picture comes from, actually. Except it comes from the internet. He's got quite a conch, hasn't he? I presume it's from an old coin or something, but he was the first King of Kent. We're now entering the Anglo-Saxon period from 825 to the Norman. And it's at that period that it would appear that Brook was really born. See, Brook was developed in an interesting area here, a strip of land no more than 2 miles wide at its widest, of a very rich galt clay, very good for growing things, a bit difficult to plough, but it was good agricultural land. And it stretched all the way from Folkestone down here and all the way along more or less to the north of Guildford. Now, a lot of Anglo-Saxon villages were developed in that area for the reason that it was very good agricultural land, and also it had plenty of streams of water coming down also from the hills. So places like Stouting and Brabourne, it's not there, but Brabourne was one. Places like Lenham and Charing there, Lenham, Hollingbourne, what have you, further up. So all these can be identified really as Anglo-Saxon villages, as indeed Brook was. We know for sure that Brook was an Anglo-Saxon village because there's a charter dated 875 when the land of the manor was given to Christchurch Priory. It was given by someone called Carloman, who apparently was a priest or a dean. They were certainly rich in those days. Anyhow, he gave the manor to the priory. So that's a very definitive confirmation that Brook is an Anglo-Saxon village. But I don't think it's really been realised that until relatively recently. Then we come to the Norman period. It's amazing how short the Norman period was, isn't it? Less than a century, and what mayhem they caused, didn't they, really? Death and etc. But eventually they did one good thing, the Normans. They produced the Domesday Book. This, of course, again, was produced for taxation purposes. Why else would they have done it? They wanted to find out how much land and exactly where it was and how rich it was throughout the whole of England. And this is the Domesday Book record for Brook. And you notice 1086, sorry about this, I'm always doing this. It's 1086, 20 years after the Norman invasion, and shortly, well, not too long, before William actually died. And it says, the same Archbishop, now they mean the Archbishop here by the Archbishop of Canterbury, because he was the titular head of the Christchurch Priory. So the same Archbishop holds one manor, rated at Now we come to measures of area. A sulong here, and also what's known as a ploughland, which we mean by arable land for 2 ploughs means 2 ploughlands. This gets into a very murky area really to what these mean. They're both based on a plough. Sul is an old word for a plough. And why have 2 separate measures? Well, first of all, it's likely that the sulong referred to the outer part of the manor, not owned directly by, well, owned by the Lord, but not managed by the Lord. Whereas the arable land, the ploughlands, was really for the whole manor, but only arable lands. So you can see we get into a very murky area. One of the biggest experts of this said it's not a topic for the tidy-minded. So I'm not going to go into it any further, except to say that from these measures, one can deduce that Brook was small, one of the smallest manors within the Christchurch Priory's lands, and they had over 60 of them, probably the smallest, in fact. And I would estimate that it was about between 250 to 500 acres in size at that time. The problem with a sulong, or the ploughland for that matter, is that it's not a geometric measure, it's a taxation measure. So a rich sulong is much better than a poor area with sulong. So you see what I mean? It's a complex area, so I will go on from that, I think, fairly quickly, but say that we were small and probably between 250 and 500 acres in size. Oh dear, sorry about this. I thought I'd avoid this by bringing my own, I obviously don't. There are 3 villains and 4 borders. Now, villains and borders were farmers who could farm the outer land of the manor. It didn't belong to them, it belonged to the lord of the manor. The lord of the manor, in effect, titular in this case, was the archbishop. But they still had duties on the lord's domain, the manor itself. The borders had the worst deal. They had a smaller area of land which they could call half their own, and they also had more to do on the lord's land as well. But basically, they could pass it on to their family as long as the Lord agreed to it anyhow. So that's what the villains and borders are. It says there's a church there. Now that's interesting, because the question is that church the one that we have here now? And the answer is almost certainly is no, it's not. I think it must refer to an Anglo-Saxon church. Now one could talk for the whole evening about the beautiful Brook Church, and it is a wonderful church. But the evidence really is, to my mind, the strongest evidence that it was built somewhere between 1100 and 1120, which means that, of course, this was after the Domesday books, so the church being referred to here has to be an Anglo-Saxon church. It was not uncommon to have Anglo-Saxon churches that were then knocked down and replaced by Norman churches in due course, and usually built in the same place. There's no physical evidence of this, but I think one could be reasonably confident that there was an Anglo-Saxon church there in Brook at that time. It says there's one mill. There's been a mill ever since then, I think, within Brook until about 1900. It says there are 2 slaves. These are usually captured soldiers or criminals or whatever. 7 acres of water meadow and wood for 10 pigs. Which is not a huge amount. Of course, they used to keep a lot of pigs in those days. And moving on from the Domesday Book, this has moved along quite a long way. You see, we're now in 1840, so we've gone along several centuries. But the reason for this jump, really, by then, it's really perhaps would be more proper to say it was Brook Parish rather than Brook Manor. But it's essentially the same. And this was the situation as it was in 1840, defined by the tithe maps. The tithe maps were drawn up in 1840, so they could start changing the old system of giving tithes in terms of so many poultry or so much corn, etc., into a monetary payment. So they had to have good maps of England, throughout England, and who owned what and exactly the acreage of the fields, etc. All this information, a lot of future information really derived from these tithe maps. Now, first of all, you can see this is the outline of the main part of Brook here, and lo and behold, there's another bit out here. So what's this little tally bit doing out here? Well, it's an interesting question, really. And it almost certainly wasn't originally there. I think the original manor would have been this bit, which incidentally is about 500 acres, so it's in the right order for the assessment made from the Domesday Book. Now, there's reason to believe that this was due to Queen Anne's bounty. Now, you not all be familiar with Queen Anne's bounty, but trouble is Henry VIII had taken so much money from the church and taken it basically for his own pockets or use or those of his friends, that the church was in a terrible position financially. So it was decided, perhaps a little bit against Queen Anne's feelings, that some of the money should be given back. And money was given back to several manors to bolster the church, because the church received tithes, so they obviously the amount of tithes money they got depended on how much land they had. So why do I think it's Queen Anne's bounty? Well, we know that this part was not really Hampton at this time in 1840. Yes, it was let's get this right. In about 1600, 1596 in fact, there was a beautiful map of Hampton. It's an exquisite map. It's unusual to find maps in any great detail before the tithe maps, but this is a beautiful map. But basically shows that at that time, I think it was 1596, or round figures 1600, the Brook wasn't there. This part of Brook wasn't there anyhow. Yeah, we know from Hasted, who was a great Kent historian, that at the time of his writing, which was 1796, shall we say in round figures 1800, Brook was in two parts. So sometime between 1600 and 1800, this part had obviously been given to Brook. And in the middle of that period is Queen Anne's bounty time. And it seems very likely, and there's some other evidence also from the history of Hampton, which would suggest strongly that, in fact, this part, Bedleston, was given about 1700 to Brook. Maybe sometimes farmers used to make their own labyrinths for fun or whatever, I don't know. Now why, you might say, what has labyrinth got to do with Troy Town as a name? Well, Troy Town was recognised as a city of a very devious city, with a lot of streets, just like a labyrinth. So hence the name, a labyrinth was Troy Town. And there are several of these. I know one near, we have some relatives on the Isles of Scilly, in a small island, St Agnes. There's a little labyrinth there. And by labyrinth, I don't mean to say it has to be big things with big hedges up. It may just be stones on the ground or turf labyrinths. That does seem to be the recognised reason why places were called Troy Town. I think the first book printed by Caxton Press was in fact a history of Troy Town, which seemed to come out about the time that a lot of these places were called Troy Town. It's probably true of this as well. Right. So this gives you the timeline. Which shows you that in 875, you had the yellow period, the timeline. These are the overall times. This Carloman gave Brook to the Christchurch Priory at this stage, and it stayed with religious authorities right until 1872, except for two brief episodes. Well, yeah, two episodes. One wasn't so brief. One, of course, it changed its name more than anything because the priory no longer existed after this time. King Henry VIII, of course, destroyed it. So it was no longer could be owned by Christchurch Priory, but he did have the goodness of heart to actually give Brook Manor and a few other manors to Canterbury Cathedral. So thereafter, it was controlled by the Dean and Chapter of Canterbury Cathedral. As far as Brook people were concerned, it probably made no difference whatsoever, but it changed its name. Back here, there was a slightly longer period where there's a bit of a problem with the Danish Vikings. They kept invading around Thanet and Canterbury, and in 1011, they actually occupied Canterbury for some time. It was Torville the Tall, apparently, who sacked Canterbury, and I guess it's better to be sacked by him than Eric Bloodaxe as York was. At least it sounds a bit better. In fact, Torville the Tall was so sorry about the bloodshed he'd caused everywhere that he actually retired a year later, went back to Denmark and had a happy retirement, I understand. But anyway, the thing is, Christchurch Priory, the land was taken from Christchurch Priory, and for some time, for a few decades, it actually went into private hands. Whose private hands? I don't know, never found a record of this. But by 1066, when the Normans came, it was in private hands. And William gave it to Hugo de Montfort, one of Odo's henchmen. Odo was his half-brother. And for 10 years it remained with Hugo de Montfort, but then Lanfranc, the first archbishop, first Norman archbishop of Canterbury, actually argued strongly for its return to Christchurch Priory. Must have been one hell of a guy, this Lanfranc, but of course bishops had a lot of influence at that time. And he argued successful at a place called Pennenden Heath, or Pinnenden Heath, I don't know where that is, but it's in, I don't know if you know where it is, but it's near Maidstone, actually in Maidstone now, in the outskirts of Maidstone. It's more or less the geographical centre of Kent and where they made all their big decisions, and also where they hung people for that matter as well. Anyway, so Lanfranc argued for its return successfully to Christchurch Priory. So it returned to Christchurch Priory until we come right up to here, which was about 1872. In fact, it was in 1862 that all ecclesiastical land had to be put up for sale. And the land was bought by the Brabournes, well, by the Knatchbull family, Wyndham Knatchbull, in 1872. And he owned the land for a few decades, and he just tenanted it out to other people. Eventually, though, the Fowle family bought it in 1900 and actually farmed it. They owned it and farmed it for about 57 years, and they ran out of male heirs. And then it was sold to Y College, and of course at the turn of the millennium it went to Imperial College. I think you know that history well enough. So that's the timeline of what happened in Brook. Oh, this just to point out that Brook did also have some land within the Weald country for pigs, feeding pigs. The Weald was used because of a lot of oak trees there, a lot of acorns, and fattening up the pigs during the autumn time was a good thing to do, fatten them up for Christmas, so to speak. Now, Brook had several dens within the Weald. These show the modern names of them, really: Bethersden, Tenton, Walden, High Holden and Woodchurch. These were big areas that had, in fact, several dens within them, belonging to several manors. Now, we do know what the name of the Brook manors are, but they're virtually unpronounceable, so I'm certainly not giving that a go. Except for, we do know some interesting things here, that Dulversden and Godmethersden, which was in Bethersden, both had timber rights in, you can see the dates there, 1356 and 1374. The thing is, these people living in these dens were actually Brook parish people, they're said to be, so they had to attend the legal sort of the legal manor courts in Brook every so often. But of course they also had a little bit of land themselves which they could tender during the summer, and during the winter they made some money from looking after the pigs, but they also cut down timber and sold it. Now that was strictly illegal, but of course how could you really sort of police this from Brook? So it was not uncommon for people to develop this system of having timber rights. So in fact, they paid so much to the main part of Brook parish so that they would have the right to cut timber and sell it. And a couple of these things have been unearthed there. So what actually happened is the pigs would come down from Brook, they'd go to one, eat up all the acorn, they'd go to another, like sort of stepping stones, back, and then they'll be going back happily fed, all ready for Christmas and a happy Christmas. Unfortunately, they were diverted, of course, to the market on the way back to Brook, but they weren't to know that. Now, this shows the manor complex, what I call the manor complex anyhow, and gives you an idea of what we find in the centre of the heart of Brook. mean, first of all, this church, I'll not say any more about that because it's just too much to say. There's also the main sort of manor house. Now, this manor house here, the one you can see now, Court Lodge, is the third manor house in this position. The first one is Anglo-Saxon, was probably in this situation. Everyone says there was an Anglo-Saxon manor house there. I've never found any evidence that is the case, actually, apart from the fact that someone found an Anglo-Saxon coin in that vicinity. But there was an Anglo-Saxon church here, so there probably was an Anglo-Saxon manor there. So I'll go along with that. The second manor house was built between 1286 and about 1320 or so. And it's amazing how much details we have about the building of that place, because it belonged to Canterbury or Christchurch at that time. And they kept very good records called the Bedell Rolls. And they show even how much it costs, a tile costs, or how much a day's labour might cost for roofing or putting thatch on, etc. Incredibly detailed and interesting. So we know a lot about the building of that manor. It was a moated manor. If you've walked up here, you'll notice, of course, that there's a moat around it. There used to be a tower gate into the area and a T-shaped house, I think, in the middle of it. Completed probably about 1350. And it's interesting that by 1400, this house was being built. So what actually happened to that house is anyone's guess, although as likely as not, it will all have burnt down. That's what happened to a lot of manor houses at that sort of time. This house, of course, is a lovely house. It's interesting house architecture, but I really mustn't get into architecture. It's been there a long time, since about 1400, or maybe in fact slightly before that, basically as a hall house to begin with, and it's had alterations since there. If you notice, the roof line alters over here, you can't see it, it goes higher, which is due to an addition about 1600 or so over an external kitchen. I better not say more about that. Then you come down to the great barn here, which is a grange barn rather than a tithe barn technically, which basically means that they collected all the corn, etc., from the actual farm, the manor farm itself in here, rather than necessarily being primarily there for taking people's tithes. Although I think it's probably almost sure that some of the local farms would have used it as a tithe barn as well. It's quite a big barn for a relatively small farm. It's a beautiful barn, beautiful structure, dating to the 14th century almost certain. There's no document which says exactly when it was built, but the architecture is that of the 14th century, and it doesn't appear on the Bedell Rolls, which have been interpreted up to about 1360. So it's likely to be the latter part of the 1300s when it was built. As it is, except for the two porches, which will come about 200 years later when they brought the larger wagons in. Then you've got some open sheds here, which are much later. They're post 1840, but they presumably kept cows in there. Then you come to the stables. Now, these are not the original stables. The original stables burnt down in the early 1900s and then were rebuilt in the same situation, the same size, etc. So they form part of the complex now, but they're not the original buildings. And of course, this whole area, of course, is the area of the museum, which we would, of course, say it's very good to visit. Little advert there. You, of course, also got the Oast House, beautiful Oast House, built 1815, so much later, full of equipment for hopping. It also shows a house here, which is the house the Fowle family moved into, because Mrs. Fowle wasn't happy staying here, because by that time it was almost a complete ruin because all the agricultural workers who'd been living there. I can assure you it's much better now. But Mrs. Fowle wasn't having any of it. She told Mr. Fowle, "You've got to build her a new house, otherwise she's leaving," or so the legend goes. And he had the house built here, Brook farmhouse, probably late Victorian, probably even Edwardian maybe. There's also the old granary here, much extended. Back here is a little bit of an extension to it, was built as a little shop. They used to keep sweets and paraffin in the same place. Apparently all the sweets tasted of paraffin. There you are. And it's the back end of the old mill just here. This, of course, is where we are right now. And this is where the old mill pond was, just behind us over there. I should point out that the monks from the priory didn't actually come over and do any work themselves. They didn't put the Wellington boots on and walk over. The actual farm was either tenanted out or they had a bailiff to look after it. This actually shows you how it appears, same area, in the tithe map. It just shows you how much detail you get in the tithe map. This shows the church here. It shows the plot number 109, and there's what's called an apportionment with this, which tells you exactly what it is, who owns it, who occupies it if need be, and what it's used for. It's a bit atypical, that, because it's a church, but there's a church there with a number by it. There's a building here that is no longer there. That was the rectory. The rectory was knocked down shortly after this, in actual fact. Any building that's coloured red is actually lived in. Any building you see that's not coloured red is a barn or something different, not lived in anyhow, like the church, for example. Down here you've got the mill. You also had an old house here that was knocked down sometime, I think, during the 1800s, as the bungalow now in its place. This is where the mill pond was, and this, of course, the river comes down here, around here, and back down the back. Another interesting thing for anyone who's worked at the barn is that the open sheds were not there in 1840. The open sheds come along here like that. There's some other structure between them. So I think from this you can say that they are, well, compared with the rest of it anyhow, relatively new. This is just a quick look at the houses in Brook. We're not to talk about the houses in Brook, that would take far too long. But this is just to show you that what houses were here in Brook and Pickersdale, I might say. Which, incidentally, Pickersdale never was part of Brook. It isn't now, never was. It's part of Wye, in actual fact, technically. But, of course, it's continuous with Brook, so it makes sense historically to consider them together. So these are the houses that were there in the map of 1840. And these are the ones that are numbered, are the ones that are still standing. And you can see them all enumerated here, from Pickersdale Farm up here down to sort of Brook End and Spelders Hill House down here. And there's one across there as well, Bettersall Farm. The ones that are starred are the ones that are either medieval or Tudor houses. So it does give you a feel this for the strength, the number of housing, amount of housing, very old housing, there is in Brook, which you might not appreciate when you actually go through it. A few houses have been destroyed. Oh yes, also I should point out that the actual parish has changed. It changed in the 1990s when, unfortunately, the Bedleston area was taken away from us, but a larger area was added at the bottom here, around about here, it goes down here, along here, and a bit of Brayborn. So it's actually larger now than it was before, but unfortunately we've lost Bedleston. What we have gained, though, is 4 pretty old houses. 4 Ways here, A, the Elms, B, Plumpton House. I'm not sure about Plumpton House, never been there, but it probably is an old house. The lovely house there, Pear Tree Cottage, fantastic architecture. And there's also Old Knackle Farm here. So in fact, we may have lost 1 old house, but we've gained probably 5. So enough for housing for the moment. Now let's get to schools. I'm going to go along a bit quicker now, I think. Schools in Brook. This shows Wexford Cottage, which is the old Dame school. Apparently in those days you could pay a pence a week and you could have your child looked after for a week. Now, I think the actual quality of teaching varied from virtually non-existent to some cases quite excellent, depending on the person who were keeping the children under control. And we do know that Wexford Cottage was one of these dame houses. Interesting cottage, of course. It looks very chocolate boxy. But of course, all the houses in Brook that are old, the ones I've been showing you starred, would have been chocolate boxy at one time. The actual weatherboarding or the tiles hung down the sides were relatively new things, post 17th century or so. And this, in fact, was weatherboarded in the earlier part of the 1900s. It's an obvious Tudor type of house with what we call baffle entrance to the front, where you could go in the front and turn left or right into the two separate rooms with the chimney straight ahead. If you find a roof in an old house like this in the middle, it's likely as not it'll be a Tudor or later house, sort of baffle entry or baffle entry house, I would call it. So that's Wexford Cottage. Wexford Cottage, incidentally, was also a butcher's at one time, because that house, actually, where Jack Richardson, I mentioned previously, was actually brought up as a child, and his father was a butcher. In fact, initially, his father was a farmer up on the top, but unfortunately, he grew hops, and it got the Vertilium wilts, which killed them all off, and he became near bankrupt. So he moved down into Brook and started a butchery business. I don't think he knew anything about butchering, but he had a gun, a few knives, axe, and he got on with it. Jack himself went up to London and was trained properly as a butcher. Brook Primary School was opened in 1877. The 1870 Educational Acts said that children had to be educated between the ages of 5 and 13, and therefore a school had to be built, or at least something had to be available for children of Brook to go to. Now, it was argued by the Education Authority that this should be in Wye, but Wye people being very difficult people, they said, we've actually got our own, thank you very much, we don't want you Brook people coming along. So eventually the Brook school was built really off-centre, if you like, right up the hill there, spelled as Hill, so that it could serve Knackholt and Hings Hill as well as Brook, so they might have enough people without having to bother the people in Wye. This is the second headmistress they had. The first headmistress, she got terrible reports, she did, because she really wasn't coping. She couldn't cope with the fact that her children often didn't turn up, and they didn't turn up for very good reasons, because they had jobs to do, hopping or jobs during harvest. Often before they came to school, they had to pick up stones from the field and leave it at the side for the family stone pile, for which the family would get some money in due course when they had a big enough pile. Or sometimes they had to deliver milk before they got to school. And she was getting a bit despaired about this, and she took to her bed, as the records of the school said. And a more sterner lady came along, Mrs. Ricketts, who lasted for several decades, and she was a great success. Despite all these problems, she had one person helping, and Miss Rogers, I think, from Willsborough, and occasional help here from the Reverend Philpot's wife, who helped with the reading, etc. So this picture was taken about 1900, I think. What about pubs and alehouses? Well, of course, I hasten to add, no one in Brook looks like this, of course. Well, you all, of course, know about the Honest Miller and this unfortunate current situation, for which I understand there's slight possibility of hope that it might open again in the future. The Honest Miller itself was almost certainly open in, the building itself was put up in 1609, but it was only opened as a pub in, I think it was 1797 or thereabouts, when the Peppers got the licenses to it. Now, English Heritage say that it was actually built in 1797, but they're almost certainly wrong. There's a clear record within the pub itself, it was actually on the wall, which gives the history rather nicely of it being built in 1609 by the Dean and Chapter of Canterbury Cathedral. It was lived in by, oddly enough, almost everyone who lived there seemed to have something to do with milling. They're either the miller of Brabourne lived here, there was a seed merchant lived there was a hopman lived there, someone who was described as grinding corn. So perhaps it's not surprising that when it did become a pub, it became the Honest Miller. Anyway, it definitely became a pub in 1796 or thereabouts, and has been had a very interesting history, of course, since then. Jack Richardson wrote a lot about the sort of activities that occurred there, bare knuckle fighting, cockfighting. The gypsies used to come down and used to have the cocks on the side of their caravans as they came down. He mentions this and the sort of games they played, etc. The history of who ran the pub, etc., is well known over a number of years since it opened as a pub. The one person most interesting to me is Billy Raines, really. Now, Billy Raines didn't actually run the pub, but his father did for 40 years, Walter Raines, during the 1800s. And Billy, when he'd grown up, actually had his own pub called the Alma, which was at the junction of on the way to Canterbury, the junction of the A28 with the road that goes up to Chollock. If you look there, you'll see an Alma house opposite. Well, that was an Alma pub when I came here, and I think it closed as a pub probably about 1995 or so, and it took some selling apparently, but now it's house. Anyway, that's where Billy Raines actually lived, but actually worked, should I say. He actually lived in Troytown House in Brook. He also had a lot of property around here. He owned several houses and quite a lot of land as well, and he used to loan the land out for the use of village people. He was a very popular person. You can see some of the old residents of Brook here. This was taken just a few years before it closed. Jack Richardson was very good at explaining the antics of some of these old drinkers. There was someone called Redmond, someone called Bonnie, someone called Old Knackle, because he used to walk down from Old Knackle Farm, and Billy Fish. Billy Fish was an interesting character as well. But if you can get hold of Jack Richardson's things, well worth reading. There were no doubt several alehouses over time within Brook, but almost certainly Primrose Cottage was one of them. We think it was an alehouse because we found a sort of urinal, a male urinal, deposited in the back garden, as well as a settle near the front door, which is very much like a pub settle, and there's an old picture showing someone having a good drink outside as well. So for these reasons, we think that it was almost certainly at one time an ale house. But it was also used for other reasons. At one time, it was a bakery. There's quite a big oven at the back of it. And at one time, Jug of Brett lived there. He was called Jug of Brett because whatever he said was always, "Call Jug of me." So he was called Jug of Brett. He made a few things, a bit of a carpenter. Always had a long white beard apparently, and a hard hat he seemed to wear. But perhaps what it's most famous for in a way is for Poppy Hickman. Now, I don't know if anyone here knew, there must be one or two people who knew Poppy Hickman and perhaps could realise one has to be a little bit careful what one says about her. She was quite extraordinary. Perhaps to give you a feel, I could tell a lot of anecdotes about her, but the one thing I remember most, I can tell, to give you a feel of what she was like. The group of us from Brook used to have a meal before Christmas somewhere. We used to go, I still do in fact, although only one of us lives in Brook now. And we were having a meal out at Charing, and who should come in but Poppy and her son, Toby. She walked 2 or 3 steps into the place, saw us in the corner and said in a loud voice, "Oh God, no." Turned around and went out. And that was typical of Poppy. She let the house deteriorate to this extent, although she had plenty of money. In fact, her parents were quite rich. They owned land in London, I believe, which Canary Wharf was built on, so there were pounds of money. They always had, they had 2 horses, or Toby did, her son. Toby went to private school in Y. He was very much kept under his thumb, under Poppy's thumb. She obviously let the house go to rack and ruin despite having money. They ate out every day because they couldn't really cook in that place. It was sometimes said that if you had a bit of a flood on there, it was a good thing to open the front and the back door and then you'd have a good spring clean. Otherwise, there's a lot you could say about Poppy, but of course it all has a bit of sadness in the background. She came down here with her husband who worked in London, and he lost his job. But he couldn't accept her, so he was going up to London every day for several months without telling Poppy. He wouldn't dare tell her that he lost his job, and unfortunately then he hung himself found hanging in the woods. So it's one of the interesting suicides around. The house, as you can see, was converted here by David Cox, who had a lot of experience with vernacular buildings, and he's gone on to have quite a big firm with building vernacular buildings or copies of vernacular buildings. It's interesting, the house, you can see he's was allowed to build on an extra bay here on the argument that there was good evidence there was an extra bay originally. And you can tell that really from the chimney here, because this is a typical medieval house. The chimney is about a third of the way along the true house, whereas here it would appear to be on the end. So that's the reason why he managed to get this extra bay built on, quite rightly, in my opinion. Shops in Brook. Brook store, yes, we got some of the occupants here on the front row. The actual original Brook store was here, this part, and it was subsequently built over here to the left and then brought forward as Brook stores, and then subsequently also built forward around here as well. So it's rather changed from its original structure. When it was extended, the original Brook house, or a part of it, was made into a separate house, and subsequently that bit was knocked down to allow building of a modern house there, which is where Martha lives. I forget the name of the house. Clovelly? Is it Clovelly? Right, Clovelly is in that position now. Well, as you can see, it's a Brook store, it's a general store, and post office as well. This shows another photograph of it. For these photographs, by the way, Malcolm Finn, who I don't think is here tonight, but he's got a fantastic collection of old postcards, really, of Brook and Wye, for that matter, and other places as well. And this almost certainly is from one of his postcards. You can see that they sell all sorts of hardware as well as general groceries, etc. One of the last owners, well, not the last owners, these were one of the most popular owners, were the Tappendons in the mid-1850s. As you can see, they had the donkey and cart, and used to go to Wye, to the station for provisions. They were very popular. He was a very good singer, sang in the choir, etc. The penultimate owner, interesting, was Mr. and Mrs. Kelly, and there's another story about them, really, because Mrs. Kelly was one of the Page, we'll come to the Page in a while, a famous family in Brook, and he obviously didn't get on too well with Mr. Kelly, and after a while, one day, Mr. Kelly was found running around Brook with a shotgun chasing Mrs. Kelly. Well, the end result of this was that in the end he shot himself, so that was another suicide within Brook. Oh, Mr. Town's a lovely chap, and some of you will no doubt recall Mr. Town. He came to Brook in about 1936, and he worked in the small holding just behind. He worked in the small holding behind this original little house here, which was owned initially by the Collins and later by the Mills. When he came in 1936, it was actually owned by the Mills, and I think he married the Mills' daughter. And they used to sell things from this shop, general things from the small holding, vegetables and fruit, etc. And eventually Mr. Town had a separate small shop built here, probably in the early 1970s, I think. And it lasted for about 10 years. In fact, when we came to the village in 1980, it had been knocked down about a year before, and all that was left was the concrete at the bottom. He was a very popular man. It was a superb shop by all accounts, keeping everything. He also ran a taxi service for children to go to school. Apparently, even in those days, sometimes they went to school elsewhere. And he also delivered milk, and he also would set people up with televisions. That seems a strange sort of combination, doesn't it? Except, as you can see, in his later age, he's still a technophile. He was a keen radio ham, and this shows him about 2 years before he died in Scotland. It was very helpful to me in collecting some of the data about Brook history. You can see the actual photograph in his hand is the one I've just shown you. A lovely chap. Then we come to Sankey House, which at one time was the bakery. In the later 1800s. This shows Amy Manuel. The Manuel family were an interesting family. They sort of came down from the hills and They had several generations within Brook. In fact, the house next to the church is called Manuel because the builder of it, whose name I forget anyhow, the builder was married to a Manuel, so he called it after his wife. This shows Amy Manuel, who was a grazier. She was a shepherd, not altogether like the Yorkshire shepherdess, but a similar sort of job. The actual house itself was owned by her brother, not by her brother, sorry, by her son, Daniel, who ran a bakery from the back. Interesting thing about this, anyone who knows Sankey House, it doesn't look like this now, does it? It's got a Georgian front to it. The front of the house was, it depends who you believe really. Someone said it was a bomb in the field opposite that blew the front off. Someone said it was a fire, and someone said it was all an insurance job anyhow. Someone was the fuss. But anyway, it's been rebuilt with a Georgian front, but the house behind it is very old. Now come to the village industry in Brook. First of all, milling. This shows the mill cottage and mill house that used to be the mill in the village. How old that is difficult to say precisely. There are bricks in the front which date the front of it to 1820s, but that might have been a new front that's been built at that time. The back of it is probably older. Whether it's as old as the records, we know about an overshot mill here back in the 1600s, there are records of it. Whether it's the same one, I'm not too sure. The actual wheel was on the side here, and the pond is behind it, and it would have, I think it's called a landau, sort of chute, a wooden chute, which would take the wood to the top of the wheel. It's nothing to do, of course, with the brook at the front, which I always thought it had. I could never work out why or how you could run a mill with that little tiddly brook at the front, but of course that's irrelevant to it. There was also a windmill. This was opposite the school, built in about 1800. It lasted for about a century as a functioning mill. The miller who used the windmill was also usually the same miller who did the water mill. Stephen Andrews and Walter Cook were the two most prominent people who owned it. When it was closed for 15 years or so, it was used for greyhound training. That's what you can see at the front there, are actually greyhound. And I think it was pulled down in 1915 or thereabouts anyhow. The school reports show that the headmistress had to pull all the curtain because the children were getting too excited watching being pulled down. There are other sort of village industries. This is cheating in a sense because the old brick and tile works were not in the old Brook, but they are in the new Brook, its extension. This area here, if you can imagine, if you're in Brook and you go up Spelders Hill, you come to the turning to Y, instead of turning right to Y, you turn left towards Ashford. If you turn left again, that's Plumpton Corner there, with Plumpton House there in the corner. If you go along here, there was quite a big brick and tile works there on the left. You can still see the pond here, the old clay pits, particularly after wet winters, etc. And if you take the footpath down here, you'll be walking on broken tiles most of the time. So it was there, in fact, from medieval times, right until the end of the 18th century. And notice that this is called Knackholt tile works. That area is really technically called Knackholt, whereas, and that shows the last kiln in Knackholt. You see all the tiles here. There's also the Knackholt tile works, which of course really has not much to do with Brook. In fact, quite a lot of people from Brook worked at these Knackholt tile works, which is, of course, as you know, Knackholt is quite near Wye. The census reports show that quite a few people from Brook worked there. This was built towards the end of the 1800s and lasted about 100 years. It no longer functioned really after the Second World War. But they used to make all sorts of, obviously bricks and tiles and chimney pots and things. It was quite a big industry. This was blown up, I think, in about the 1970 or thereabouts anyhow. There's also the Pays carpentry business. Now, I could tell you an awful lot about the Pays. They're particularly interesting to us because, partly because my eldest son did a school project on the Pays and the Pay family. So he perhaps first got us interested in the history of Brook. They ran a carpentry business from behind Yeoman's Cottage here. This is Yew Tree, Yeoman's Cottage and Brook House. Not a huge amount of sheds, but it was quite a big business. The Pay family were quite a rich family. They came from Wye in about 1726. It was an Augustine Pay married William Clark's daughter, Jane Clark. There were 6 William Clarks in a row, actually, generations. I'm not going into that, living at Court Lodge. Anyway, he married her and they had a son called Thomas, one of 3 male children, Thomas, William and John. And then there were another 2 generations after that, all consisting of John, William, Thomas, John, William, Thomas. There were a few other children along the way as well, but there were always those 3 in the family's generation. Well, it was Thomas who first started the business, but then it went to a John, and they lived initially almost certainly in Brook House, and after a time, although they still owned Brook House, they actually moved to Yew Tree. They owned all the land from here and all the buildings here. They had Red Lodge built here in about 1840 or so. They owned the actual post house, although they didn't look after it, except for Mrs. Kelly, of course. She was a Pay. So it's a very big family in Brook for a couple of centuries, really, with a large carpentry business. They also built the forge. Just go back one there. This is the forge here in front of Brook House. It was built in about 1840, about the time it was built, and it was used obviously as a blacksmith's forge. And the only blacksmith they had, I think, was Mr. Pilcher, who lived actually on Spelters Hill. But he had help from his son and also from some assistants. But in about 1890, he finished doing the blacksmith business, and it became a chapel for a while. It was taken over, all the machinery was taken out, and it was actually painted blue inside as well. Some of the stones presumably are still blue there to make it look heavenly. And this shows a photograph of when it was in use as a chapel. In 1920, the Methodist chapel was built more or less opposite it, and therefore it fell into some sort of dereliction. At least it did when I was owning it. This shows what I think of as the last of the Pays. This is Louisa Blanche. She is quite a strong character. She's also quite clever, according to the records of the school, whereas her brother John, who had another John in the family, wasn't too bright, and he failed to take the baton on with the business. So, in fact, the carpentry business disappeared. Louisa Blanche lived on in Yew Tree House, died in the 1960s, and the clock on the church was put there in memory of her. She was married to Mr. Hammond here, who was the sexton of the church and also a small-time farmer as well. Oh, farming in Brook. Sorry, I'm going on a bit. I'll go even quicker. Farming in Brook, we do have, it's not a talk about farming per se, but we do have some interesting information. This shows land usage during the 14th century, showing the dates up here, 3 dates, and the total acreage that was used for agriculture. And you can see 1291 is 85.5, 1322 is 71. It's gone down somewhat. They had terrible weather apparently in the 14th century. It might have been a factor in that. But a bigger factor here, the drop from 71 to 44 acres, I don't know if you guessed this, but 1348 was the Black Death. And the population decreased by about 1/3 to 1/2, and you can see the usage of the land sort of decreased to that extent. This shows that most of the things grown is wheat for human consumption, barley for human consumption in the form of drink for the most part. In this sort of age, of course, people didn't drink the water, they drank beer instead. People have said over the years that in fact it doesn't matter too much because the beer wasn't very concentrated. But I've read recently, in fact, just as concentrated as we drink now, so I don't know how they stayed standing. Oats were passed used for human consumption, but also for animal feed, but not for horses, because horses wouldn't have been used on the farm in this sort of period. Legumes are important because they add nitrogen to the soil, and the people have realised that crops are better if you grow legumes every so often between the other crops. They could also be used for human consumption, but also used a lot for animal consumption as well. Oh, this is just a quick one. Just shows Hinks Hill, because it's Hinks Hill, really, so it's a local photograph. It shows agriculture at a cusp, a change from horses to steam power. You can see there's here a steam machine in the middle, which operating a threshing machine, which is behind this horse here. So you've got the horses still on the scene. This one taking the corn away, it's been threshed, and this horse has got a barrel of water. Not beer, barrel of water, which is not, of course, for human consumption, but of course for consumption by the steam engine. So horses were still useful. Interesting photo, and it is a local photo. This shows William Hancock, who was said to be the last person who used a flail in Brook. This is for threshing the corn. He lived at Pickerdane Cottage, tragic in a way, although he was a well-respected person. He had 4 sons. 3 of whom died in the First World War. The first one was the one who didn't die, was the one who volunteered to begin with, and he volunteered to go to India, which seemed a good idea. In retrospect, he was the one who survived. He was also the village carrier, so he'd be sort of like the Tesco person of today. He'd pick up the order, go into Ashford, and come back with it every week and deliver it. This just shows the different fields and what they were used for. The red is the arable fields, the blue dots are the fields for pasture. There seem to be more blue dots than red, which there are more blue dots, but in fact the red dots are larger fields because they were arable fields. It also shows the sort of where the hops were grown in green, and yellow were meadows. And this also shows the land usage in 1840 in terms of acreage here. Notice that hops is not a big hop area, never was Brook. Most hops were grown, of course, in Sussex. Locally in Kent, the hops would sort of tend to be grown towards the sea on the dip side, on the slope of the limestone. This, again, just picks out the fields in green, which were the hop fields at the time. This, interestingly, the hop field belonged actually to the manor farm, not to the oast house, which is actually next to it. But there's not a huge amount of hop farming, but there was obviously some. This just shows the Court Farm Oast, which is now, of course, the Brook, belongs to the Brook Museum, full of all sorts of interesting hop memorabilia. To urge you to go. It's an interesting roundel type of hop. It's round, made in 1815. The earlier oast houses tended to be square, and then it was thought that they made them round to get a more even distribution of heat through the drying floor. It's probably not true in retrospect, but quite a few were built in this roundel form. This, more or less the last one, shows, well, it shows the great, the great aunt of Victor here, Jane Dodd, and her hopping people. Now, Jane Dodd was a very interesting character. She was the village midwife. She also looked after the chapel. She also obviously did hopping in her spare time, and she also laid out dead bodies. So that's a pretty good CV when you think about it. Very versatile lady. Almost certainly this is her son Frederick by her side. Unfortunately, Frederick died in the First World War, one of 11 casualties from Brook. And it just shows a general local group of people hopping. Here's a talisman with his tally stick, etc. Lastly, this shows Brook Barn Museum. It shows the barn from the inside. It's a lovely barn structure, which one could talk a whole evening about, which I will not leave to here. But it contains a lot of equipment. I would stress, actually, that the actual museum we have here, and I've looked at most farm museums, if not all, in England and Wales, The actual collection here is only second to that of Merle. That's the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, which is associated with the university. That's a superb museum. But second to that, the actual contents of the museum there are brilliant. Okay, some of it needs some conserving, a bit of conservation is required, but that's true wherever you look. It's all these museums are around the same. However, I would urge anyone who would like to get involved with conserving some of the machinery to do so. And anyone who hasn't been should go and have a look around. It really is quite a superb museum. And finally, this is the final one, just to show you where all this information comes from. Primary sources here comes from Domesday Book, hearth tax, no window taxes. They were lost in the Second World War in Southampton, all by bombing. Land tax records give you information about this era, tithe maps and apportionments, census reports, vestry minutes, fascinating vestry minutes about what happened in the Middle Ages, births, marriages and deaths, wills, deeds and inventories. Got quite a few of those collected which give you important information. There's Kelly's Trade Directory, which is useful also, and various postcards and photos. All this is sort of like primary information. Secondary information, well, Hasted was a famous Kent historian. The advantage was he had access to some documents that are no longer available, particularly in the post-Norman period, and what's more, he could actually read what they say. So Hasted had a lot of useful information. Jack Richardson we talked about. He talks about the period of 1900 to 1928. Rachel Deanst, who unfortunately I think died last year, I think she died, wasn't it? Wrote about the war period here and her experience of it. Cora Harrison was a brilliant head teacher. She was only here for a couple of years, and so she was headhunted to go elsewhere. But she really made the children interested in local history, and she herself had some experience of local history, so she found some documents. Ian Mickey, who still lives up down Troy Town, he wrote a book in 1997 about the history of Brook. He was asked to do so. It was mainly about the history of the church, really. He was asked to do so in the 900th year since the church was supposed to be there. And he was told he had to do it in 6 months. Now, no one really quite knows exactly when the church was built, to be honest. So what all the rush was about is perhaps questionable. But anyway, he did a fantastic job in the time that was available, although he would be the first to admit that he could have done with a bit of editing, perhaps, but he was fully aware of that. Oh dear. I've written a book as well because I've done some research, particularly on things like the census reports, tithe maps, and land tax, etc., and also gathering information from people like wills, deeds, and inventories and things like that. And there are others as well. And perhaps I should mention the architect from I forgot her name, Jane Wade. Yeah, Jane Wade from Canterbury School of Art, who in fact has looked at several of the houses in Brook. This is back in the 1980s, which my wife Joyce instigated her to do, and her and her students and their examiners have given a very excellent insight as to what the houses that we have, etc. Well, I'm sorry I've rushed you through, and I've spent quite a lot of time doing that as well. But anyway, at this stage, I'll finish. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Graham, for a brilliant talk, and thank you everyone for coming. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but if anyone wants to talk to Graham on the way out, then please do. He's a fountain of knowledge about the area, genuinely. Just a couple of points I wanted to highlight before we go. So, as you know, this is the first of 3 talks that we're running, and also we'll be running some other events throughout the summer. And if you'd like to find out more about them, there's some flyers at the back of the room if you want to pick one up on your way out that just lists all of these events that we're doing. So the next talk is in February, which is about hopping in Kent. So you can learn about hop picking and people involved. That's on February 28th. And the other thing I really want to highlight is that what we really would like is feedback, because all of this has been funded through the National Lottery Heritage Fund grant, and what they are very keen from us is to receive feedback about what we're doing, and if people are enjoying it and what you think. So we have an online feedback form. So I will be sending it via the Brook WhatsApp group, but also if you would like to give us feedback, could you please write down your email address on the piece of paper at the back that says the email address, and we will send you some feedback to complete. If you don't want to do the online feedback, I've also got there's a booklet at the back which just says feedback. If you want to just write down any comments, anything is of value, because we can send it back to the Heritage Fund and say, yes, please, can we have another grant? So yes, thank you very much for coming, and thanks again to Graham.
Oh, look at my water, eh?